America, it is said, is suffering from intolerance. It is not. It is suffering from tolerance. Tolerance of right and wrong, truth and error, virtue and evil, Christ and chaos. Our country is not nearly so overrun with the bigoted as it is overrun with the broad-minded. Quote from Fulton J. Sheen. Since it's Memorial Day weekend at the time that I'm recording this podcast, we'll read 2 World War I stories from the book American Gun by the legendary war hero Chris Kyle. Just a warning, there's going to be some salty language in this book that I've taken out, so if you're going to buy it, just keep that in mind. I've been really excited to get into these because they're such American classics. So let's lock and load. Chapter 5. The M1903 Springfield. The French told us that they had never seen such marksmanship practiced in the heat of battle. Marine Colonel Albertus Catlin, 1918. On June 2, 1918, it looked like the Germans were about to win World War I. The Russian army had collapsed, and a peace treaty between the two countries was signed in February. That set nearly 50 German divisions loose. They were switched to the Western Front, and the German General Staff got ready to push the Allies to the sea. German planes bombed Paris. Their long-range guns lobbed shells in the direction of the Eiffel Tower. The British High Command started planning how to get its troops back to England without having them swim. The German army had seized the initiative and shattered the spirit of the Allies. Oh, and they had Mausers, too. The imminent capture of Paris was likely to deliver a psychological blow the French would never recover from. The Germans pressed on, sure that the Allies would soon be forced to sue for peace. Just 45 miles northeast of Paris, near a patch of forest called Bella Wood in the town of Château-Thierry, U.S. Marine Corps Colonel Albertus Wright Catlin saw the leading edge of the methodical German advance as it steamrollered through the French lines. The Germans swept down an open slope in platoon waves, he recalled, across wide wheat fields bright with poppies that gleamed like splashes of blood in the afternoon sun. It was a thing of beauty, unless you were tasked to stop it. The French troops fell back, fighting as they retreated across the wheat field. Then the Germans, in 2 columns, steady as machines, wrote Colonel Catlin. To me, as a military man, it was a beautiful sight. I could not but admire the precision and steadiness of those waves of men in gray, with the sun glinting on their helmets. On they came, never wavering, never faltering, apparently irresistible. What the Germans didn't know was that a force of thousands of tough young U.S. Marines was lying in wait for them, supported by thousands more U.S. Army troops nearby. In a desperate last-second move, they had been rushed to the scene as a blocking force to stop the German advance. It had been more than a year since America declared war on Germany, but its troops had yet to play a major role in any battle. That was because the Allied High Command didn't think the American forces were ready to fight. They thought them soft and unprepared. Before they arrived in 1917, one British general even proposed that American recruits be used directly as replacements in British divisions, entirely under British command, and the Americans wouldn't have that. Even so, General Pershing, the commander-in-chief of the American Expeditionary Force, knew there was a lot of truth in the harsh assessment of his troops. He spent the better part of 1917 and the first half of 1918 training them up. Now they were ready. Blackjack, who we saw in Cuba as a lieutenant, had been urging the reluctant Allies to get his Marines and soldiers into real action for months. The German offensive made the French so desperate they had no choice. The U.S. 2nd Division, which included a brigade of Marines, and the 3rd Division were moved into positions along the line of the expected German advance. Every one of the Marines lying in ambush was a highly skilled, long-range rifleman. The Marines were supported with some artillery and machine guns, but their main instrument of battle was the light, accurate, bayonet-tipped M1903 Springfield rifle. Each Marine had endured 8 weeks of brutally intense training at Parris Island, South Carolina. Drills that included extensive practice in the care and feeding of his rifle. Besides long-distance marksmanship, there was also close-quarter bayonet and hand-to-hand combat training. Unlike the Army, which assumed mass firepower from large units and didn't pay too much attention to marksmanship, The Marines started from the idea that they'd be fighting in small units that had to make every shot count. As they arrived in the fields near Bella Wood that early morning, one of the Marines asked, "Where's this here line we're supposed to hold, Sarge?" The reply, "We're gonna make a line, sonny." The French had a line, but it was moving the wrong way. Now the Germans were aiming to blow a gap in it that would take them from Bella Wood across the Marne River and on to Paris. The Americans were between them and the best road to Paris for miles. As the Americans marched in, Captain Lloyd Williams of 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines Regiment, was advised by withdrawing French Army troops that his best bet for survival was to fall back. "Retreat? Heck," he said. "We just got here." All the Marines felt that way. As one commander explained to a French general, "We will dig no trenches to fall back into. The Marines will hold where they stand." The Germans who came through the wheat field that afternoon had little or no idea they were about to stumble on American Marines. Their intel had them facing the crumbling French army, and their eyes told them no different. The Americans waited until the right moment, then unleashed a barrage of rifle and machine gun fire on the German spearhead. Marines methodically picked off individual targets with their Springfield 1903s from hundreds of yards away. "The French told us that they had never seen such marksmanship practiced in the heat of battle," recalled Colonel Catlin. "If the German advance looked beautiful to me, that metal curtain that our Marines rang down on the scene was ever more so. The German lines did not break. They were broken. The Boches, Germans, fell by the scores there among the wheat and the poppies. They hesitated, they halted, they withdrew a pace. Then they came on again. They were brave men, we must grant them that. 3 times they tried to reform and break through that barrage, but they had to stop at last. The United States Marines had stopped them." The remains of the German force retreated into the thick cover of Bella Wood. A delighted French pilot swooped low over the scene and signaled "Bravo" to the Marines. A savage back-and-forth bloodbath followed over the next 3 weeks as the two sides fought for control of Bella Wood. The terrain was straight out of a nightmare. A barely penetrable 200-acre tangle of thick vegetation stocked with German mustard gas mortars and machine gun nests. In the words of one Marine commander, it was like entering a dark room filled with assassins. Plagued by confusing orders and bad maps, scanty food, little intelligence, and poor communications, the American Marines and soldiers launched 5 failed attempts to sweep the forest, coming up short each time. On June 6th at 5 p.m., clutching his bayonet-tipped M1903 rifle, Sergeant Major Dan Daly rose from the wheat and yelled to his Marines the order to advance on the German machine gun positions bracketing the edge of the forest. "Come on," yelled Daly, who at 5'6" weighed all of 132 pounds. "Do you want to live forever?" The only thing small about the sergeant was his height. He'd already received 2 medals of honor for conspicuous bravery under fire, one in Haiti and the other in China. 1,000 Marines stood up and ran forward when he yelled. The Germans unleashed a fierce barrage of rifle, machine gun, and artillery fire. "The losses were terrific," said Colonel Catlin. "Men fell on every hand there in the open, leaving great gaps in the line. 3rd Battalion Commander Major Ben Berry was wounded in the arm, but pressed on with the blood running down his sleeve. Into a veritable hell of hissing bullets, into that death-dealing torrent, with heads bent as though facing a March gale, the shattered lines of Marines pushed on. The headed wheat bowed and waved in that metal cloudburst like meadow grass in a summer breeze." When they reached the trees, Private W.H. Smith and his squad put their Springfield 1903 rifles to good use against lingering German troops. There were about 60 of us who got ahead of the rest of our company. We just couldn't stop despite the orders of our leaders. We reached the edge of the small wooded area and there encountered some of the Hun, German, infantry. Then it became a matter of shooting at mere human targets. We fixed our rifle sights at 300 yards and, aiming through the peep, kept picking off the Germans, and a man went down at nearly every shot. German officers and soldiers were stunned at both the tactics and the appearance of the attacking Americans. The Marines used knives, revolvers, rifle butts, and bayonets, complained one German. All were big fellows, powerful rowdies. The Marines were so fierce, the Germans were convinced that they were drunk and oblivious to pain. My guess is that they were just being Marines. Or, as a German military report put it, vigorous, self-confident, and remarkable marksman. A letter was found on the battlefield in which a German soldier despaired. "They kill everything that moves." Yes to that, and they still do. By midday, the Marines had settled things. They owned the woods. The Germans weren't getting to Paris, except maybe as tourists after the war. It was the bloodiest day in U.S. Marine Corps history to that point, with 1,087 casualties, more than the Marines had suffered in the Corps' whole previous history. But they died heroes and helped save the war. It would be nearly 3 weeks before the sector was completely secured, but the last great German offensive of the war was pretty much history. The grateful French renamed the forest Bois de la Brigade de Marine, or Wood of the Marine Brigade, and awarded the 4th Marine Brigade the Croix de Guerre. Chapter 6. The M1911 Pistol. Beyond a doubt, there is no other service handgun made in the lifespan of the Colt 45 that can equal or even approach that of the M1911 government model when it comes to resolving conflicts, stopping fights, and keeping Americans alive and fighting. Wiley Clapp, American Rifleman. On October 18, 1918, a tall, red-haired American Army corporal found himself behind enemy lines in the Argonne Forest in France. German machine gunners on a nearby ridge were sweeping the bushes around him with bullets. A slug slapped a hole in his helmet, though it somehow left his skull intact. The corporal had 2 weapons, a rifle and a handgun. The first was an M1917 infield bolt-action rifle, a British rival to the Mauser in Springfield that was a little cheaper to make. The second was a .45 caliber semi-automatic Colt service revolver with the official name of automatic pistol, caliber .45, model 1911. It was a weapon that in the right hands could turn bad luck good, just like the guy holding it. The trapped U.S. Army corporal's name was Alvin York, and the pickle he found himself in had materialized quicker than a New York minute. Bare moments before, the soldier and 16 other men from Company G, 328th Infantry, 82nd Division, had surprised a group of German troops and taken them prisoner behind the lines. But before they could organize the POWs, the Americans came under concentrated machine gun fire. 9, including the sergeant leading the 3 squads on patrol, fell to the ground, all dead or severely wounded. They were spotted and pinned down by a force that outnumbered them 20-1. 6 Americans were shot dead. "The Germans got us, and they got us right smart," remembered York. "They just stopped us dead in our tracks. Their machine guns were up there on the heights overlooking us, and well hidden, and we couldn't tell for certain where the terrible heavy fire was coming from. And I'm telling you, they were shooting straight. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machine at home." York grew up in the mountains near the Tennessee-Kentucky border. Before the Army, he'd been a hard drinker, a brawler, and a bit of a redneck goof-off. Somehow he'd grown into a gentle, God-fearing Christian. He'd also become a pacifist and tried for conscientious objector status. In fact, it had taken a long talk with his unit commander before he decided his duty as a soldier didn't conflict with his beliefs. Crouched on the ground, York held his bolt-action Enfield with one hand as bullets flew over his head. He waited for the machine gunner above to stop firing and look down. York was between the prisoners and the machine gun nest, so close to the enemy that the Germans had to pitch the barrel down sharply to get at him. The nearby POWs made things tougher for the gunner. He had to get a good fix on his target before firing or risk killing his own people. Sure enough, a head popped up. York squeezed the trigger. The German disappeared, dropped by a .30-06 round from York's rifle. York waited. Up came another head. York fired, and the enemy vanished. "That's enough now," he yelled out in his hillbilly drawl. "You boys quit and come on down." The Germans didn't take his advice. They'd been in the war long enough to know that his Enfield only had 5 rounds in the magazine, so maybe when a lieutenant and 5 men jumped out to take him with bayonets, they figured they had numbers on their side. Problem was, York didn't use his rifle next. He switched to his M1911 pistol. And instead of taking down the first man in line, which might have sent the others scurrying to the ground, he worked from back to front, popping them one at a time until finally it was the lieutenant's turn. The German officer fell with a scream, gut shot. "You never heard such a racket in all your life," said York, talking about the battle after it was done. "I didn't have time to dodge behind a tree or dive into the bush. There were over 30 of them in continuous action, and all I could do was touch the Germans off, shoot them down just as fast as I could. I was sharpshooting. All the time I kept yelling at them to come down. I didn't want to kill any more than I had to, but it was they or I, and I was giving them the best I had." Finally, York sensed someone behind him. He spun around to see a German officer in the woods with an empty Luger pistol. The German had been trying to shoot him, but missed every time. Spooked and sure that York would kill every last member of his unit, the man offered a deal. "If you don't shoot anymore, I'll make them surrender." Covering the officer with his M1911, York told him to go ahead. The lieutenant blew a whistle, and 50 Germans emerged with their hands up. More followed. One diehard threw a grenade at York and the 6 other Americans who'd survived. The grenade missed. York didn't. Another German stalled when told to leave his machine gun. York shot him, too. "I hated to do it," he said later. "He was probably a brave soldier boy, but I couldn't afford to take any chance, so I let him have it." York ordered the officer to guide them toward American lines. The mass formation marched off, with the 7 Americans using the Germans as human shields. They gathered more prisoners as they went. After they reached safety, York reported to battalion headquarters. "Well, York, I hear you captured the whole darn German army," said his brigade commander, General Julian R. Lindsay. "No, sir," said York. "I only have 132. When someone asked the corporal how he did it, he gave them a Tennessee smile. "I surrounded him." York's shooting had been honed through thousands of hours of practice in the mountains where he'd grown up. There he'd hunted with a muzzle-loading Kentucky rifle his granddad had used. The gun was an authentic American long rifle, ball, black powder, and all. He also had an old-fashioned cap-and-ball revolver he shot for target practice while riding a mule. Like many guys from backwoods rural America, he was a crack shot, but probably the high point of his unofficial training had to be the hidden turkey shoot. It went like this. York and his friends would tie a turkey behind a distant log. The shooter would have to knock it down the first shot as the bird poked its head up. That itself was pretty hard. Turkey heads aren't too big. But just to make it interesting, his friends could do anything they imagined to distract him in the act of shooting, short of actually touching him. Crack jokes, holler, whistle, it all taught York to shoot with supreme focus and aim. A day after his tromp through the enemy lines, York went back to the scene of the battle. He was shocked by the corpses still lying there. He stopped and said a prayer for his dead friends, then thanked God for letting him live. "I prayed for the Germans, too," he admitted later. "They were all brother men of mine." As word spread, York's actions seemed just too incredible. A thorough military investigation was launched. But eyewitnesses and German reports largely confirmed the events. York's division commander, Major General George B. Duncan, said, "The more we investigated the exploit, the more remarkable it appeared." A legend was born. York was soon promoted to sergeant and awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Croix de Guerre, and the Legion of Honor. "What you did was the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe," declared French commanding General Ferdinand Foch. Before returning to Tennessee, York received a ticker-tape parade in New York City and was carried on the shoulders of Wall Street stockbrokers. Offers from Hollywood, publishers, and companies seeking his endorsement streamed in. Sergeant York lives on in American mythology as one of the toughest soldiers who ever lived. The government model 1911 pistol he used to pop those Germans has a place right next to him, too. And that's the end of our section of American Gun by Chris Kyle. I hope you all have an amazing Memorial Day weekend. God bless America.